What's up guys, I'm Lee Morris with Fstoppers.com, and today we're going to discuss, is it possible to shoot astrophotography and astrophotography time lapses using Micro Four Thirds camera? As you guys have probably heard, about a year ago we switched from shooting with Nikon cameras for video over to the Panasonic GH5. And almost every single thing that this camera does in terms of video is better than our old D750s by Nikon. In reality, the Nikon D750 is a still camera first and a video camera second. It's like an added on feature that we were always kind of working with and making it work. And the GH5 is the opposite of that. It's a video camera first with still camera functions. And moving over to this camera has been incredible in almost every way, except for one, and that is the ISO performance of this camera. Now, 95% of the time we're not shooting in super dark situations, and so it's really not a big deal. But we take a lot of time lapses, especially when we're working on photographing the world with Elia Liccardi. And in many cases we're shooting time lapses in sunrise, sunset, and then totally at night. We're trying to take astro time lapses any chance we get. So we always wondered, is it possible to actually shoot stars and shoot star time lapses with the GH5? And what we quickly learned was it's really not. The settings you need are f2.8, ISO 3200, and around 15 seconds. And this sensor is so small, it's a Micro Four Thirds sensor, that when you're trying to bump up the ISO all the way to 3200 ISO, you're getting a lot of grain. But then when you're also dragging the shutter and you have multi-second long shutters, you're having even more grain introduced. And so the time lapses that we were getting with this camera with a 2.8 lens really were not acceptable. So what we've been doing is we've been traveling with another camera just for star time lapses. We might bring 4 GH5s to shoot video with, and then maybe we'll bring one Nikon DSLR that we can shoot night time lapses with, or one Sony camera. But Panasonic recently released their new camera, the GH5S, which has approximately 2 stops better ISO performance. And so I thought to myself, you know, we're getting really close. If we have 2 more stops, maybe it would be possible to shoot the stars with this camera. So before we went on the road with Elia for this last time to film Photographing the World 4, it's currently in production, it's not out yet, but we brought this camera, and then I thought to myself, I'm gonna look and see what other wide angle lenses there are, because maybe there's a faster option out there that will get us even better low light performance. So the main wide angle lens that we own is the Olympus 7 to 14 millimeter 2.8 lens. And this lens is a beast. This is by far the nicest, heaviest built lens that we have for Micro Four Thirds. It really feels like a professional lens. And this thing's expensive. I think it's like $1,200 or $1,300. So it's certainly not cheap. Now, it's a 2.8 lens, which is great for full frame cameras, not as great for Micro Four Thirds, but this is pretty much as good as it's going to get if you want a zoom lens. Now, I went on B&H before I left just to see if there were any other options, and there were a couple of primes that stood out to me, so I got both of these on loaner. The first one that we'll talk about here is a Voigtlander lens, and this is a 10.5 millimeter lens f.95. And this lens is approximately 21 millimeters on a full frame camera, which honestly is not wide enough to shoot the stars in most cases. In most cases, you're gonna want to be, you know, around 15 millimeters on a full frame lens. But I thought, hey, it's a 0.95 aperture. We'll give it a try. Now, the other lens that I got, this little guy here, it's ridiculous. I cannot, this is the worst logo in the history of all logos. You cannot tell what is up or down on this logo. I cannot read this. I just was on B&H making sure that I knew this name brand, and now I'm looking at it and I've already forgotten it. I think it's Laowa, I think is the brand of this lens. Whoever designed this logo, you need to find another job. This is the worst logo I've ever seen. If you can't even read the product name when it's right in front of you, you have failed as a designer. Anyway, this lens is a 7.5 millimeter 2.0. So this lens is approximately 15 millimeters on full frame. It's not quite as fast as the Voigtlander, but it's f2.0, which is better than the Olympus. So I thought I'll get one of these as well. Now, quickly talking about price, like I said earlier, I think the Olympus is $1,200 or $1,300. The Voigtlander, I believe, is around $1,100, incredibly expensive as well. And then the Laowa, or whatever this is $500. Certainly not cheap, especially for how cheap this lens feels, but it's a lot more reasonably priced than the other two. Now, before I get into the nighttime test that we did down in Patagonia, let's quickly talk about the sharpness test that we did here at home. Once again, we shot our patented ugly yellow brick wall. Let's first talk about the Olympus lens. In the center, it looks nice and sharp, but if you're shooting at 2.8 all the way zoomed out, you will notice that the edges start to lose a little bit of resolution. They start to smear a little bit. Moving over to the Voigtlander, shooting at 0.95 is definitely soft, but if you stop down to 2.8, it does perform better than the Olympus, so that's something to consider there. If you don't care about zooming, this could be an interesting option for you. And then the Laowa lens, it had a significant vignetting problem, but it actually was pretty sharp. Even at f2 and at 2.8, it got even sharper. So for $500, I definitely didn't expect it to be as sharp as it was. It does suffer from vignetting, but sometimes when it comes to video, I might like vignetting a little bit, and if you don't like it, you can fix it. It's not that big of a deal. So I'd much rather have a sharp lens that vignettes than a soft lens that doesn't vignette. So it's definitely not as bad as I expected. So when we got down to Patagonia, we shot a million different time lapses with both the GH5 and the GH5S. Like I said, I think the GH5S has approximately 1.5 to 2 stops better ISO performance. If we were to throw the Olympus on this camera, we would be able to shoot at 2.8, ISO 3200 and 15 seconds. Or we could go to 30 seconds and then we could drop the ISO down to 1600. Now, the Voigtlander lens is a 0.95 aperture lens, and I actually had to double check this just now. That is a 3-stop improvement over a 2.8 aperture. That sounded too good to be true to me, but I guess that's the case. So if you were shooting at ISO 3200 before, you could go from ISO 3200 to 1600 to 800 to 400. Shooting the stars at ISO 400. That's absolutely crazy. Now, at ISO 400, you might actually be able to get decent shots of the stars with the GH5. We didn't have very many clear nights, so we shot lots of dusk time lapses, but we only shot 1 or 2 star time lapses, and we used the GH5S for that. So what's also great about this Voigtlander lens is the build quality of this thing. It is built like a tank. It's probably one of the heaviest lenses I've ever felt of its size. And the focus ring on this thing is so nice and smooth, and the focus measurements here are actually accurate. This is so important when you're shooting in pitch black darkness. You have nothing to focus on. Keep in mind this lens is not autofocus at all anyway, but even if you had an autofocus lens, if you're trying to focus on stars, it's just not going to work. So you need to do tests with your lens and figure out where infinity actually is, and I'm happy to say with this lens, infinity was actually accurate here. So I could just turn on my cell phone, set the lens manually, and get the stars in focus every single time. The other thing that's cool about this lens is it has an aperture ring that's smooth moving as well. So you can actually change the exposure much more smoothly than you can with any other lens I've used. This is almost like a cinema lens in that sense. So if you wanted to really track from a bright scene to a dark scene, you could do it manually by changing the aperture without clicking through each one of the stops or 1/3 stops. Now, the only issue that I have with this lens is that it's just not that wide. At 10.5 millimeters, it's like 21 millimeters on a full frame camera. That's fine for a lot of things, but if you're shooting the stars, in many cases you want to shoot something in the foreground and you just want to see the whole sky. So it's just not quite wide enough for the stuff that we do. So in comes the Laowa lens. This thing is 7.5 millimeters, approximately 15 millimeter equivalent, and f2. So this is still a 1-stop improvement over the Olympus lens at 2.8. So we were actually able to shoot around ISO 800 to ISO 1600 using this lens on the GH5S, and we were able to get really clear looking night shots as well. Now, when you compare the way that this lens is built to the Voigtlander, it's kind of laughable. It looks kind of like a plastic toy. Maybe this is made of aluminum. It's not plastic, but it's just no comparison whatsoever. I did a few tests and I found that the infinity sign on this lens was pretty accurate for the stars, but I've read reviews online of people saying that it's not consistent, and on some lenses it's different than others. And so if you buy this lens, you need to make sure that you do tests before you get out into the field to make sure your infinity sign is right on the money. Sometimes you might have to be slightly to the left or to the right of it. The aperture ring on this works a little bit more standard. You're not going to set the aperture in the camera, but you are going to set it on the lens, and you can actually feel and hear each one of the stops of the aperture as you move the ring. Keep in mind that this is also a manual lens, and although I'm not the type of guy to autofocus while I'm recording, I am constantly using autofocus to set up each shot ahead of time. So using both of these two lenses for time lapses was actually great. It was a pleasure to use a manual lens because I wanted to get it right on the money and I wasn't moving around, my subject wasn't moving around. But when it came to actually filming Alaya, who's always moving around, I didn't want to use one of these lenses because I do still rely on autofocus. So we've talked about a lot here, but let me kind of wrap this up in a conclusion. Basically, if you're out to shoot stars or star time lapses, I simply cannot recommend the Panasonic GH5. It's just not going to give you a clean enough image to make your pictures or your time lapses acceptable in my mind. So I would just kind of leave this camera at home if that's what your intention is. Now, when you consider the GH5S, this is getting into the realm of acceptable to me. It's still not the best camera when it comes to shooting the stars. I would highly recommend using a full frame camera, Nikon, Sony, Canon. Any of those are probably going to be better than this camera, and you could get the Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter lens. It's going to have the zoom range and it's going to be ultra wide, and it's cheaper than both of these lenses, which is pretty crazy to think about. However, if you're like us and you're trying to move over to the GH5 and you want to be able to shoot video on it too, and then getting the GH5S does actually work to shoot stars, especially if you start moving into these other two faster lenses. The Voigtlander is an incredible lens. It was an absolute pleasure to use. This thing just feels like a professional tool, but for the price, I can't fully recommend it, especially for stars. It's not quite wide enough. It's also not that sharp at 0.95. So it's a great lens, especially if you could find it used somewhere. I highly recommend it, but for over $1,000, that's kind of a hard pill to swallow. The Laowa lens, surprisingly, I thought this thing was going to be a total joke, but I might actually buy this lens. It's so small and it's so easy to just throw in your bag. It's almost like it's not even there. It looks like a toy. And we were actually able to get some really nice time lapses with it. So for 500 bucks, for us personally, I think this is gonna be the lens that we're going to buy simply because we already own the Olympus. So that wraps up this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. For more content just like this, head over to fstoppers.com. And if you'd like to check out our full-length photography tutorials, head over to fstoppers.com/store.